Okay, so the discussion that we're having is, where is Har Sinai? This is something that's very relevant to our portion. Moshe appears at Chorev. Moshe meets Aaron at the mountain of God. The burning bush is on Mount Sinai. And most people, if you ask them, where is Mount Sinai, they'll tell you it's in the Sinai Peninsula. But as I said, I was waiting for this book, and this book has arrived. This book has arrived. Searching for Sinai, the Location of Revelation, by Alexander Hall. And I read this book and devoured this book. I much appreciated it. I reached out to the author. I asked him a few questions. And so what I'd like to show is what this author's thesis is, and his argument about his proof that Mount Sinai is A, not in the Sinai Peninsula, but B, it is associated with a specific mountain, a very, very specific mountain, which nobody heretofore is associated with, which is in Saudi Arabia, near the Red Sea, in Saudi Arabia. So first thing, we'll have to go and say, how do we know that it's not in Sinai? How do we know that it's not in Sinai? So for this, he argues, hold on, let me go to this. He argues he has 9 reasons to prove that Mount Sinai is not in the Sinai Peninsula. 9 reasons. Okay, so let's go through his 9 reasons. And many of them relate to our Parsha. So that's why I wanted to refer to them this week. So first of all, if you go to chapter 4, verse 27 of the Exodus story, chapter 4, verse 27. Hold on, let me open it up right here. Chapter 4, verse 27, it states that the pasuk tells us, the verse tells us, "Vayomer Hashem o Aaron lech likrat Moshe midbarah," that God says to Aaron, "Go meet Moses, go to greet Moses in the wilderness." Vayelach vayifkasheu b'har ha'elokim, and Aaron went and he met Moses at the mountain of God, and he kissed him. Vayishako, and he kissed him. We already said on last time we met that Rabbi Soloveitchik said that Moses used to frequent this mountain often. So we're going to assume almost everybody assumes, I've never seen anybody argue differently, that Midian is to the southeast of Aqaba, that Moshe was in Midian, and Midian is to the southeast of Aqaba. So that if Moshe is going back to Egypt, it doesn't make sense to assume that he's going through the Sinai Peninsula. It would have been out of his way, exceedingly out of his way, to go to the Sinai Peninsula, but rather he would go straight from Midian, straight into Egypt, without going through the Sinai Peninsula. And so therefore, we're going to assume that therefore it's logical to assume that they were not in that this was meeting place was not in the Sinai Peninsula. That's his first argument. The second argument, it says in Exodus 3:1, this is something that I referred to last time. It says that Moshe Yaroeh Tzon Yitro Chotno Kohen Midyan Vayinhag Tzon Achar Midbar Vayavo Elokim Chariva. And Moses was guiding the flock of Yitro's sheep, and he was guiding them in the wilderness, and he came to the mountain of God in Horeb. So obviously Moses is his father-in-law Yisro is a Kohen of Midian. He's a priest of Midian, and so he's leading his father-in-law's flock. So if you want to assume he's leading his father-in-law's flock and he goes to Mount Horeb, you would have to assume that Mount Sinai is in Midian and not in the Sinai Peninsula. That's so obvious. So this is what he writes: placing Midian off the coast of the Red Sea and opposite Tabuk, where when I go to visit Mount Sinai, I'm going to find to Tabuk, which is like a 2-hour drive from it. And Moses would have hundreds of kilometers in Saudi Arabia to pasture his flock, and he for sure wouldn't have to bring them into the Sinai Peninsula. So that's another very strong proof that Mount Sinai was in the Midian and not in the Sinai Peninsula. 3. The third argument is chapter 4, verse 14, also in our parsha. So it says that Hashem says to Moshe, "Vayicharaf Hashem b'Moshe." God gets angry at Moshe and he says, "Aaron, your brother, is a Levite, and I know that he will speak, and he's coming out to greet you. And when he sees you, his heart will be glad." So this tells us that Aaron has set out to meet Moshe. So in that time, Aaron is setting out to meet Moshe, and Moshe was talking with God at Mount Sinai. Moshe then goes back to get his wife and children, and then returns and meets Aaron at Mount Sinai. So this is what Rabbi Hul writes. If Mount Sinai was anywhere in the Sinai Peninsula, it doesn't make sense that Moses is going to go all the way back. That Moses would have gone all the way back to Midian and then return to meet Aaron at Mount Sinai. If Mount Sinai was anywhere in the Sinai Peninsula, the distance traveled by Moses would have been far longer than the distance traveled by his older brother. And Aaron would have arrived at Sinai many days before Moses, which did not happen. So, okay, that's the third. So all three of those proofs are from our portion. Then his fourth proof comes from Exodus chapter 13, which states, hold on, let me open it up. Exodus chapter 13, which states, hold on, here we go. Exodus chapter 13, verse 17 and 18. This verse states as follows. At the beginning of Beshalach, it says, Vayhi Beshalach Paro Asam. God was sending out, when Paro sent out the people, Lo nacham elokim derech eretz Plishtim. God did not want to send them by the way of the Philistines because that was too close. So what did God do? Vayisav elokim esam derech hamidbar Yam Suf. God led them out through the wilderness, through the Yam Suf. So this indicates that the natural route to Sinai from Egypt was along the southern borders of Israel, which is where the Sinai Peninsula was. So God did not want them to go that route. So instead, if it was a circuitous route, that would have been through Midian. It's also natural, just if you're thinking about it as a historian, that Moshe would take them back through the land that he knows very, very well. And if he's leading his people, he's going to go back through the land that he knows very well. Okay, now we go to later on in the Torah portion. So this is Numbers chapter 33. When we get to Numbers chapter 33, there's another attempt here. Hold on. Now we're going towards the end of their journeys. And that tells us, it says that when it lists all of the journeys in Numbers chapter 33, it lists all of the journeys where they traveled. And it says that after they crossed the Red Sea, it says that they came back to the sea for a second time from before going into the desert. If you look at verse 8, that they crossed over the sea into the wilderness. This is something we don't always focus on. It says explicitly in the Torah that after they had crossed the sea the first time, then they went out to Piachirot and they crossed the sea again. So what sea is that? So it must have been that they crossed. He said that this author writes that the natural explanation is that they crossed the Red Sea a second time on the way to Sinai as they're passing the eastern arm into Saudi Arabia. But if they were in the Sinai Peninsula, it wouldn't make any sense to say that they would be crossing that again to go into the Sinai Peninsula at that point. So it must be that they're crossing over the Red Sea to get into Midian. That's the most obvious because there's no other way where there's two crossings. The only way that you could get two crossings is if you're crossing into Midian. Okay, now go back to Exodus 6, chapter 6, verse 1. If you go back to Exodus chapter 6, verse 1, Hold on, this is next week's portion, which we're going to get to. Actually, wait, it's the last verse of our portion. So it says in Exodus 6:1, it says, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe. God says to Moshe, Ata tireh et asher aseh leFaro. Now you'll see that which I will do to Pharaoh. Ki biyad chazakah yishalchenu. He will send you forth with an outstretched hand. Biyad chazakah yagashem me'artzo. So let's see what he does with this verse. Hold on one second. Let me actually pull this up. Okay. Oh, it's not Exodus 6:1, Exodus 16:1. That was why I was missing it. So if you go to Exodus 16:1, it states in Exodus 16:1, hold on, let me pull this up. It says, right, they traveled from Elim, and the entire congregation of Israel came to Midbar Sin, which is between Elim and between Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they left Egypt. So in this verse, the Torah is telling us that the Midbar Sin, the wilderness of Sin, was stretching all the way from Sinai so that the Sinai Peninsula is one large stretch of wilderness. So if Har Sinai was really in the Sinai Peninsula, then the Midbar Sin would not have ended by the second encampment following the crossing, but it would have stretched all the way to the Red Sea. So why would you say it ended there? So if you put, however, the Har Sinai in the Saudi Arabian desert, then it means to say that the Midbar Sin equals the Saudi Arabian desert, which does end at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. And so that really could have been the second encampment that they made after they crossed the western arm of the Red Sea. So that one makes sense. Okay, so now he has three more arguments. It says that the Bnei Israel came to Olush. This is an argument from rabbinic tradition, but he's basing some of it on rabbinic tradition. Now it says that the Israelites arrived in Olush, which was 2 stations away from Sinai. And we know that the Targum Yonasan tells us it was a fortified city. And the Gemara and Yoma tells us it was built by one of the giants of Hebron. So the Sinai Peninsula doesn't have cities. And in Jeremiah chapter 2, we're told that the Israelites were taken out of Egypt into a wilderness that had never been inhabited by a man. So if that's the case, Olush could not have been situated in the immediate wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula next to Egypt, because the Sinai Peninsula didn't have any fortified cities. But if Mount Sinai was in Saudi Arabia, they would have passed by the Gulf of Aqaba. And the Gulf of Aqaba has today like 100,000 people. So therefore, that's most likely where Olush was. People are, I guess, think about like Sharm el-Sheikh. These are places where a lot of people go, unlike the Sinai desert itself where nobody lives. Now we go to Deuteronomy 2:7, book of Deuteronomy 2:7. And so what does Deuteronomy 2:7 tell us? Hold on, chapter 2, verse 7. Chapter 2, verse 7. It says in chapter 2, verse 7, Ki Hashem lokacha be'rachacha. Hashem, your God, blessed you with all your work. That God, your God, took you through this desert for 40 years. You lacked nothing. So Hashem took you through the wilderness, and for 40 years you lacked nothing. So this teaches us that this verse is telling us that the Israelites were in this wilderness for all 40 years. That this is a problem because we know that the Bnei Israel only left Sinai in the second year. It was only the second year that they started traveling away. That was in Numbers chapter 10, verse 11. So this teaches us that Sinai must have been in the same wilderness. Har Sinai must have been in the same wilderness which they spent 40 years in. So therefore, Seir, where they were for those 40 years, is the same wilderness where Har Sinai is. Har Sinai was in the wilderness where they spent for 40 years. It wasn't the Sinai Peninsula and then the Saudi Arabian desert. It was both the same. So where was Seir? So we know that Seir was a mountainous region, and we know from Numbers in Deuteronomy that it stretched from the corner of the Dead Sea until close to Eilat and Etzion Gever, which lie by the Red Sea. Now, this is really right north of current day Saudi Arabia, if you look at the map. And so therefore, if they were encircling Seir, it would mean that they were in the Saudi Arabian desert. And so therefore, Sinai must have been in the Saudi Arabian desert. That's a pretty strong proof. Now we go to the last proof that he has, that the Sinai desert is not the home of Mount Sinai, and that is from Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2. Let me read for you the verse. Let me read for you from the very end of Deuteronomy, very, very end. Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2. Chapter 33, verse 2. Hold on. Okay, here we have it right here. It says in the verse, "Vayomer Hashem mi Sinai ba v'zarach me Seir lamo hofia mehar paran." That God came from Mount Sinai. He shone forth to them at Mount Sinai after having come from Mount Seir, and he appeared at Mount Sinai after having come from Mount Paran. So Hashem came forth from Sinai, Seir, and Paran, meaning to say, the Midrash explains that Hashem came from three directions: north, west, and east. So we know that the Israelites encamped to the west of Sinai. So Sinai was in the east of where they were camping. So Seir must be the north or the west. And Seir is a mountainous region to the east of Israel, east of Eilat. So therefore, it's not going to be the Sinai Peninsula. And the wilderness of Paran is situated to the south of Israel. So since Paran lies to the south of Israel and Seir lies to the east of Israel, it makes sense that Paran lies to the west of Seir. So therefore, Mount Sinai must lie somewhere south of Seir, which is present-day Jordan, and east of Paran, which is south of Israel, and in Saudi Arabia. It's again a very clear proof. Anyway, these are his 9 reasons why the Sinai desert cannot be the home of Mount Sinai. But let me just pause for a second if anybody has any questions. Does anybody have any questions? Let me see. Okay, I see no questions. So now, let me now go to his argument. How does he know where Mount Sinai is? Because let's assume that Mount Sinai is in Midian, which is Saudi Arabia. Okay, so now we have a bigger problem. What's our bigger problem? The bigger problem is, up until recently, nobody was in Saudi Arabia. So really, people weren't able to tell. So therefore, if nobody was in Saudi Arabia, how was anybody to know what it was? So there were several attempts throughout the years to determine where indeed was Har Sinai. So in 1926, there was an explorer by name of Musil, and he argued that it was Mount Badir. Mount Badir is possible, but his main argument was that it had a place of water and vegetation and space. And they have nearby there a cave, which they call the Cave of Moses. And at the foot of there's a 12-stone altar, and there's a valley nearby that's called Al-Harob. So that was his argument. But the problem with his argument is it seems to go against rabbinic tradition, because we know that the water was not at Sinai. They had to bring water there, so from the Torah. And so therefore, Also, it was an active volcano. Also, that also seems to indicate that why would Moshe Rabbeinu graze his sheep by an active volcano? Has anybody ever been to an active volcano? I've been a couple of times to an active volcano. There's nothing to graze on. It's all ashes. Where was I at an active volcano? Two places, in Guatemala and in Catania. I was at two places, active volcano. So therefore, it's most likely that it was not Mount Bedir. So then recently, if you go on YouTube and you say, or Wikipedia and say, where is Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia? The number one answer that comes up is Jebel al-Lawz. And in fact, I was thinking that was my first thought, that I was going to climb Jebel al-Lawz. Till I looked in and I saw, hold on, I see you have a question. Just give me a minute to make these points and I'll come back to you, promise. I see you have a question, just give me a minute. Okay, yes, Carol, what's your question? Okay, so.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I recall when we were in Eilat, Jordan was next to us and then Saudi Arabia. There's a piece of Jordan that goes,
right.
We're not next to Saudi Arabia. Jordan is in between. It's not much.
But it's very, very close, especially at the Gulf of Aqaba. You can get there.
Yeah.
It's less than an hour drive. It's very, very close. Very close, especially down there. Oh, you're breaking up. So you're breaking up. It's a bad connection. But it's very close. And if you look at the map, you see you could easily go from Midian and cross right in to present-day Eilat. So let me just finish what I was saying here. That Jebel al-Lawz is a very tall mountain and if you want to climb it, which I looked into, it's a stage 5 climbing, level 5. You need ropes to get to the top. But that's only if you want to go to the peak. If you go like an hour walk, then you come to what's called, they have a cave there called the Cave of Elijah, which is accessible. And the reason why it's called the Cave of Elijah is there's a tradition. Elijah is the only person in the Bible after Moses, to go to Mount Sinai. Elijah is the only person after Moses to go to Mount Sinai. And he sustained himself in a cave and the ravens brought him food. So there's a tradition that has the Cave of Elijah. And also it's on the eastern shores of the Gulf of the Aqaba. So that would seem to be promising. And also Josephus states that in his book of Antiquities, he writes that Mount Sinai was the highest mountain in the region. So therefore, since Jebel al-Lawz is 2,580 meters, now he argued that this was the right identification of Mount Sinai. So what happened was he went in the first year in 1984. This American explorer named Ron Wyatt, he entered into Saudi Arabia and to look for the mountain, and they caught him and they arrested him and they kicked him out of the country. But they let him back in the next year. And then he had a Saudi Arabian partner, and he claimed that he found substantial evidence, and he produced photographs. And these photographs showed a blackened mountaintop. He said this shows that there was intense heat on the mountain, and probably that's where the fire came down during Mount Sinai. Number 2 was he had a photo of the altar of the golden calf, and that there's a rock there near Jebel al-Lawz, which has carving of a calf in it. And they didn't have, in that region at that time, they didn't have cows. So they were saying that maybe this is where they made the golden calf. And also he produced a photo of a rock that Moses hit to bring forth water. And you'll see this when the tour guides are already showing me this picture. There's a rock that has that's a giant rock which has a split down the middle, and they said that's the rock that Moshe Rabbeinu hit. But that's the one that most of the people on YouTube and the internet think is Har Sinai, but there is a lot of problems with it. First of all, the altar of the golden calf we know was destroyed in the Torah. Second of all, we know you can't prove to me that this was the mountain because the top is burnt, because the burning bush was not consumed, so the fire wouldn't have left a mark. And also, I mean, there's just a geological peculiarity that there was a rock with a crack in it. It doesn't mean that was the rock. So basically, one of the biggest problems that catches our eye is that Mount Josephus says it was the tallest mountain, but the Gemara in Sota says that Mount Sinai was specifically chosen by God because it was the smallest mountain in the area. So that's what I'm sure many of us have heard. And also, it doesn't seem, I'm going to go to God willing to Jebel Al-Aouz, and I'm going to do some prayers there. But most likely, it's not Jebel Al-Aouz. And so therefore, Rabbi Hul argues, and he has a whole book, which you could buy on the internet for $9. $9. And his argument is that there's another mountain. And when I called my friend, and I said, take me to this mountain, he said, oh, nobody ever goes there. But this is the real Mount Sinai. I've read his book. It's very conclusive. There's a small mountain called, believe it or not, that Sinai has 6 names. Mount Sinai has 6 names. One of the names, the most popular of all the names aside from Sinai, is Chorev. Chorev. There's a mountain in southeast of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is called Jebel Hareb, Jebel Chorev. It's spelled exactly like it, Harb in English, Jebel Chorev. That's what it is, Mount Chorev. Literally what it's called. You don't even have to look too hard. It's called Mount Chorev. So that's the Chorev region of Saudi Arabia. And we know that he writes here, he argued that the Israelites arrived at Sinai. It was a day's journey from Rephidim. So if you go from Rephidim, 12 kilometers southeast, the place that the world identifies with Rephidim, you travel 12 kilometers, approximately you figured out 8 or 9 miles. Then you're going to come to a flat region of Al-Kharab. It takes us, he says, to the doorstep of an unassuming little mountain called Jebel Chorev, Mount Chorev. And he says, so that's what he says. He says there's a small mountain there called Jebel Chorev. The author of this book never actually traveled to Saudi Arabia, so he doesn't know for sure. He's basing it off of internet imagery, Google imagery. But the problem is, I called up my tour guide and I said, I want to go to Jebel Chorev. And he said, it's the tallest mountain in the kingdom. He said, so this seemed to be a problem. We're going to have to deal with that issue. But before we get to that, it says that there's a cave at the top of the mountain, because we know Elijah, when he ran away, he hid in this cave. And also we know that Moses in Exodus 33:22, he asked God to see his face, and God said, stand in the cave and I'll pass by you. And Moses was able to see the back of God. Saw God's tefillin. So there's a cave on the mountain. And so this rabbi, he looked on Google imagery, you could see that there's a cave there. So I said to the tour guide, who I've been speaking to, who's been all over Saudi Arabia except to Jebel Chorev, I asked him if there was a cave. Okay, number 3, he says he thinks he can look like Google imagery and sees that there's a hole in the rock, which is he thinks is indicative of the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was standing there when God passed by. And he also argues that there was a lot of bushes around Jebel Harev, which is consistent with the fact that the burning bush was out Mount Horev. So one more thing is in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 21, Moshe says that there's a stream going down the mountain. And so he says, if you look at the mountain, you could see a dried riverbed. Anyway, so what's his strongest argument? His strongest argument is that if going back to our portion from the very beginning, that Moshe told Aaron, Hashem tells Moshe that Aaron is on his way to meet him, and they meet at Sinai in Exodus 4:27, again in our portion. And in between that, Moshe goes back to Midian, picks up his wife and children. He picks up his wife and children and returns with his wife and 2 children. So he says, if you do the math, Jebel Harev is 600 kilometers from Egypt and 200 kilometers from Midian. So if Moses, because he's traveling back with his wife and children, is traveling 1/3 slower than Aaron, then it works out that they will meet each other at exactly the same time. If Aaron sets off from Egypt and Moses goes back from the mountain, picks up his wife and kids, and then goes back to meet them. So that's one of his arguments. Okay, but now we get back to the other argument which we made, which was this rabbi writes that Jebel Harev is the smallest mountain. And the tour guide who I spoke with said Jebel Harev is the largest mountain. So we're now in a bit of a pickle. But he has an answer. It seems from rabbinic sources that Mount Sinai was actually a mountain on top of Mount Horev. So Mount Horev was a smaller mountain surrounded by larger peaks. So there were mountains upon the mountain. There was mountains upon the mountain. And so there were different elements. And so therefore, this seems to be that their midrash says, there's another midrash that says Mount Sinai was 500 amot high, and amma is 18 inches. So basically, by his measurements, if he says if we look at the contour lines of the mountain, you can basically make that argument that it matches exactly. I mean, he hasn't been there, so the only way we can tell is by going there ourselves, really, to see if he's correct. But he also says, if you look at the photos of Mount Harev, you can discern 2 ridges. One is 1/3 of the way up the mountain, and the other is 2/3. And so this also corresponds to the Torah, because Moshe tells us that the Torah tells us that he was supposed to go up the mountain with Aaron, and Aaron stopped at one level and Moses stopped at a higher level. So therefore, Aaron stopped 1/3 up, Moses stopped 2/3 up. And that seems to fit perfectly with the ridges that are on the mountain. So, okay, then he has three more proofs, and they have to do with mathematical proofs based upon the synchronization. But anyway, that's his basic argument, that Jebel Harev, which the world has not recognized as Mount Sinai, he recognizes it as Mount Sinai. So let me just pause for a second, stop the recording, and see if anybody has any questions.